Are you guys
All right, welcome. A little bit late, I apologize, my fault. And I do want to welcome you for this event today. I want to say, so this is the defense of Mariela Noles Cotito, who is here to fulfill the partial requirement of her double MA she's getting. So this is the political science part, where she wrote a thesis. She is the first student that we have to actually pursue a concentration in Africana studies, which we have created new. And this is the first year we're doing this. Maintaining the other concentration in liberal arts, but we have a new concentration in political science. He's the first one to do it. Not the last one, we have other people already involved in this as well. And she will still have to fill the requirements for her other master's degree, which is in Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino studies. So today, she will present to us for about 15, 20 minutes. 20 minutes? 15 to 20 minutes. The master is entitled From Blacks to Afroperuvians, the Building Process of the Black Political Subjectivity in Peru. And I'm really glad, and I want to introduce the committee members here. To the sides, you can see them. So we have Hordge-Freeman, who's actually the co-chair. So if you want to say something also, you should maybe, or I don't know if you want to, but she's a co-chair, so this is kind of totally not the only one here. Vanden, who has been accompanying this for a while, and Tanya. Hernandez, who joins us from Fordham University in New York. He's the external. So the procedure, I think, is known to everybody, which is let her talk, and then we open up questions. I don't think we need to have fixed order and who asks what first. We will have questions and time for questions, and then we have a moment of everybody leaving the room and we deliberating, and then we call everybody back in. That's the idea. It should be done in an hour. That's also good. All right. You want to say something?
No, thank you everybody for being here. We're really excited about this presentation. I think that one of the things that's distinctive is that Mariela's work really represents the type of interdisciplinary work that we try to promote, that EFLAC has tried to promote, and that Tesis has tried to promote. So I think that this is a great opportunity for us to see that type of work firsthand. So thank you all for being here.
Right.
So thank you everybody for coming. I would like to thank my committee, and especially Professor Hernandez for flying in from New York. Also I'm extremely special placing my heart is regarding my courses in here at the Paula, Dr. May, Ruby Corner, Rosario, Liz, and Dr. Rodriguez. So I would like to start my presentation with a video. What is interesting about this video is that it was produced by the Ministry of External Commerce and Tourism in Peru as part of the brand Peru National Campaign. So I would like for you to see how Peru is branding itself.
In a world where the sun walked the earth, where gods were hidden within stones, and ancient cultures dominated the oceans. A world where death created life. And then communicated with the universe. In this world, where the sun's sweat and the moon's tears protected the chosen ones, a magical legend emerged to forge the Inca Empire. Destined to be one of the greatest civilizations of all time. An empire where the immensity of magical lakes blended with cities that were born from the earth. And the bravest of warriors traveled from unknown oceans to fortresses hidden in the mist. Peru, empire of hidden treasures. 5,000 years of history, still alive. Don't watch the movie. Live it for real. Visit Peru.
So, this narrative about Peru is actually prevalent abroad, where my country is known for its indigenous landmarks, for Machu Picchu, and it's a narrative that is, of course, upheld by the society at large, but also by the Peruvian leaders, by the Black Peruvian leaders. Indeed, this is actually the narrative that I grew up listening to from them, right? That people are invisible in every decision-making spaces, if ever, always overrepresented in the arts, in the sports, but not really in a significant way, in a form in which they can contribute to society. In 2013, my career path takes me to the Ministry of Women, and from there, among my tasks about international women's rights, I kind of stumbled upon randomly with the work of the Afro-Descendant Women Task Force. Knowing, or rather learning, that this institution existed within the structure of the government was kind of a shock at that time. And actually piqued my interest to verify what other institutions or spaces within the governmental structure were there for Afro-descendants to assert their rights, or that they were there to promote or protect them. Also, learning about this institution contradicted this narrative that I grew up saying. So in 2015, when I come to USF and I get a bigger platform in order to actually continue this pursuit in an academic way, I make of this subject my research topic. What I found preliminarily at that time is that we had, or what I knew at that time, is that we had a robust body of legislation, instrument, of political and legal nature that would promote and protect the rights of Africans. That would, for example, indicate to national agencies how to prevent the African population from not being beneficiaries of the specific measures, or that would assure that this population is not to be excluded from the benefits of different measures. Another interesting thing that I found is that most of them were actually dated after the year 2000. Indeed, what I found is that we would only find two before the year 2000, which was the Declaration of Independence in 1821 and the abolition of slavery in 1854. One of the instruments, for instance, to highlight is the Stark Public Apology in 2009. So in this year, the government of Peru promulgated a historic public apology to the Afroperuvian population in the following terms. The Peruvian government expresses a historic apology for the abuse, exclusion, and discrimination committed against the Afroperuvian population from the colonial times to date, recognizing its efforts and contribution to the national identity, the culture, and the defense of the territory. At that time, I thought that the major event that had promoted the shift in the racial politics in Peru was the Third World Conference Against Racism. And indeed, I actually wrote a couple of papers. When I decided to make this my topic of thesis, then of course delve more into issues with more data, and analyzing the topic further, my research question became an inquiry about the extent of the change that the protective legislation had on the Afroperuvian population at large, and how that had affected, if ever, if not, the Peruvian society at large. Or in other words, what is the extent of the change created by the new in the Afro-descendant population in Peru, and certainly in the Peruvian population at large? To answer that complex inquiry, I utilize two levels of analysis. I, of course, rely heavily on primary sources, political instruments, the letter of the law, the specific political instruments. But of course, I turn to secondary sources and rely on them heavily to explain the Peruvian context, to help me contextualize Blackness in Peru in both pre and post-colonial times, and Blackness now, and to help me explain and contextualize. So after a more extensive analysis of the sources and the data used, I found the following. The first is that placing Peru in the context of the region, the Latin American region, and the political trends at the turn of the century will reveal that the emergence of interracial legislation was not the doing of the Third World Conference Against Racism alone. Rather, it followed the regional trend of constitutional multiculturalism that started around the year 1970, where most of the countries in the Latin American region start to leave their dictatorial past and move position into democracy. Further, the specific timing for Peru obeyed to the alignment of a number of elements in the international and national arena that explain the emergence of interracial legislation. These elements for Peru specifically included, for instance, a strengthened Black transnational movement, a sympathetic international human rights agenda, the support of international agencies, of course, the Third World Conference Against Racism and their preparatory meetings for the Americas, but also an empowered Black movement at the national level, and a government in transition that needs a win. It is to be remembered that at that time, they are leaving the government of Fujimori and going transition to a democratic. Another thing to highlight was the amount of protective instruments, actually. Because I had to focus on interracial legislation for Afro-descendants, I also have to pretty much figure out what is the complete legal framework of the interracial law in Peru. So what I found is that we had approximately 64 elements, 64 pieces of legislation of public policy that protect both Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples, including the ones in situation of limited or initial contact. But the ones that promote and protect the rights of Afro-descendants are probably 30, including instruments that actually criminalize racial discrimination. Still, and finally answer the specific question that I said to respond, I found that the situation of Afro-descendants did not change significantly beyond the affirmation of their political subjectivity as now being irrelevant. We found evidence of this in national reports from the Ministry of Women, the Ministry of Culture, the National Ombudsman Office, studies by different private and national universities within Peru, and even we have some international research. For instance, we have a book by Professor Bolash Bosa, Yo Soy Negro, Blackness in Peru, But she also describes that the situation is not necessarily the best, even despite the legislation being part of the legal framework. So in some, Black leaders were partially right. Afro-descendants were no longer invisible, as their political subjectivity is actually now affirmed in the law. They are subjects of law and public policy. But they still do not make part of the Peruvian nation in a significant way, or at least their contributions are not highlighted in a significant way. And it's even less if you think about Afroperuvians living in rural areas or everybody is the same. While their political subjectivity was now being affirmed, this has not affected significantly the material conditions of their existence. And of course, ending my work in such a somber note was kind of discouraging to me because I am Peruvian and I am Afro-Peruvian. So I decided to embark in an even deeper reflective work about which could be the causes for this. And of course, I bring along with me an approach that is available to me because of my training, which is the legal analysis. So using these lenses allowed me to see that one of the major limitations to the betterment of the lives of Afro-descendants are rooted precisely in the extensive faith that has been placed in the legislation to resolve the Black issue without an important account for its shortcomings and its own limitations. From this perspective, I propose a few policy recommendations, and I will only mention two. The two that I found more pressing, and they will actually reveal a little bit of the shortcomings. So, having the full social inclusion of Afro-descendants and the protection of their full citizenship as a main goal, I call for a formulation of political measure that address to seek the eradication of the social problem of racism instead of just focusing on the legal issue of racial discrimination. So in other words, because I know that this can be confusing, is one of the things that I found is the ethno-racial law in Peru, particularly, is focusing on the elimination of racial discrimination. And of course, racial discrimination is one of the expressions of racism, but it's not necessarily, it's only focusing on this, it's not necessarily attacking the big problem that is causing. And of course, measures like that would include curriculum reform, where we actually highlight the contributions of Afro-descendants from the pre-colonial times to the colonial times and post-colonial now. Actually, the study of the cultures, of African cultures, or measures that, while respecting freedom of expression and the freedom of the press, actually regulate in a more strengthened way the programming of broadcasting, the programming that reinforces or recycles racial stereotyping, for instance. Related to that, I call for the development of instruments that do not have Afro-descendants as the sole subjects of the law. Because as we know, racism cannot be eradicated from the perspective of the victims alone. Right? And I also call for the specific legislation to broaden its scope to actually reflect the Black experiences, not only of Black men in the city, but also people living in rural areas, women living in rural areas, and Afro-descendants living in rural areas. At this very moment, Peru is at a crossroads. Our last president just resigned, we just got a new one. It's not clear yet if he's going to call for national elections, or if he's going to finish the tenure of his predecessor. So in some way, the stability of the country is still unknown. What we know for sure is that the path towards Black liberation in the country is static. And despite its shortcomings, many of them highlighted in my text, we are well on our way to the consolidation of Black citizenship. Thank you.
Question? we could, but we don't have to.
I'd like to start actually. I'd like to start by saying that I thought that this was an exceptionally done project that you spent an extraordinary time working on and revising over and over again, and you should be really proud of what you were able to produce. And one of the things that I think is particularly powerful about this is that you go beyond the theory. You introduce it towards the end, where you really bring your legal expertise in order to be able to say it's one thing to critique legislation, it's another thing to be able to propose modifications. I thought that was really something that will be useful, and I'm looking forward to hearing you talk about how your solutions are responded to when you get that through. So with that said, there are always questions and limitations and ways to push your work forward. And I won't ask all of my questions now, but one of the things I want to ask you about is that theoretically you ground your work in Tanya Pachel's research. And her research focuses largely on data from Brazil and Colombia. So how would you respond to a critic who might say, well, you really rooted your work very strongly in this work. How relevant is this work for the Peruvian case, particularly as an Andean country? Is that, how can you justify using Tanya or Pachel's framework to ground your work? So I'd like you to respond to that question. And my second question, this will be my last one for now, is what are the possibilities now of continuing? To what extent are Afroperuvians now building on what you refer to as transnational synergies? To what extent do we still see this happening in current contemporary Peru?
Yeah.
So one of my yes. So I do understand, and actually that's a very valid piece that I am anticipating on will get a lot in terms of why am I using authors that are writing about other realities to write about Peru. And the thing is, and this is actually the main reason, one of the main obstacles that I found when I studied this project is that there is almost nothing written. So actually the work that I had to do was try to use the models that different authors have to study Nicaragua, to study Ecuador, to study Brazil, and kind of make it work with the elements that I find through that were relevant, that were to be relevant, and that could be used in an equivalent way. One of my intentions was precisely with this work was precisely contribute to the scholarship that we about the political system in Peru and the racial politics. But definitely I was very cautious about always trying to not necessarily apply a model as is, but try to identify what are the elements behind the model that the authors are using to see and to really verify if they can be applicable. In terms of the transnational movement, I think that the collaboration that is starting with Bernd is actually well sustained now. We see it even more strongly in the case of women, where women have created their own brands and networks to keep pushing forward and advocating for different measures at the regional level. But yeah, it is a trend of collaboration that is still.
Whoever wants to go, feel free.
Okay, Gary.
Okay. Yeah, no, I particularly liked it. I was not only living in Peru, but I was a Peruvian resident for a couple of years in the 70s, and was absolutely vast with racism, institutional racism, cultural racism, which was to a large degree, as I think about carried down to the present day. So I particularly liked the thesis, and I liked the very subtle analysis. I thought it was really good. I thought things like distinguishing, picking up on my colleague's question, distinguishing countries that are primarily indigenous or which have marginalized indigenous people from those that sort of have a plantation economy is excellent, because indeed, Peru and Ecuador are quite different, not only from Brazil or Colombia, Cuba, Dominican Republic, etc. I did want to query you firstly, though, on your title. What do you mean by subjectivity?
So,
Do you mean the political subject?
pretty much. The thing is, before Afroperuvians, which is a political label, or a legal label that has been created around the year 2000 for this legislation in particular, we didn't have the call for Black people, if you will, in any kind of political instrument. So we still remain with this socially accepted Black that started all the way. But then when we become subjects of the law and subjects of public policy, from there is that I affirm that there is a belief of subjectivity for the Black person.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. That's right on. That's very direct, but I'm not sure that's the primary definition of subjectivity. I think you might want to change it to political subject or something like that. Subjectivity could sort of get into that whole phenomenological thing, Merleau-Ponty, etc. The idea, of a subjective definition, subjective feeling, versus objective. I think you're right on the political subject. Secondly, I was wondering if you wanted to develop the process of multiculturalism or multinationalism more. I was a little surprised that you hadn't at least looked at some of the work by David Dixon and perhaps I was negligent about. I think I mentioned it in contact with him earlier, but he did his dissertation on his site on the committee on Afroperuvians. And as I remember, he was struggling very much with using, in essence, international human rights legislation, agreements, treaties, as a means of, finding, protecting Afroperuvians, who are, if not as marginalized as Afroperuvians, perhaps similar. So I think I gave you some sources, so it might be good to see what he. Because I would note, though, that I think his analysis was not as taken as far as yours was. It goes back, I guess, to the early 2000s. We should look him up. He's now an associate professor at Howard. Help you. And I was a little surprised that there wasn't something where you looked at a little bit at the general writing on Afro-Latins, racism in regard to Afro-Latin Americans in Latin America. His book, and it's an earlier work, which is just sort of background, nothing near the subtlety or incisiveness of your analysis. By Mike Conifer was actually directed here. I think it dates back to the 90s, and maybe other things. I wasn't sure if you might be served, or if you considered sort of having a short section, sort of a literature review, in which you perhaps define literature a little more broadly at all. Some very specific sources extremely well. Also, apropos to the concept of multinationalism or multinational country, you mentioned a little bit the Chinese and Japanese, but you sort of left them out too. Are they more invisible than Afro-Peruvians? Because there is or was a significant group there.
No, it's not, and I know when you bring that up because we don't learn from Asians.
Sorry?
But no,
Yes.
so no, yeah, but no, I actually do not focus on that because that was a moment in the text where I think I'm describing what was the situation or how would the demographic landscape look, and the fact that a Chinese contingent was brought to replace the Black hand, and around the same time or a little after, a Japanese contingent came to the country. It was more of a description part rather than an analysis of how they made part of the Peruvian society, which is also why I don't really delve that much into multiculturalism, because I don't necessarily get into that. But definitely I'm taking the note. I can realize that.
Ecuador, to a large degree, particularly Kalani, National Confederation of Indigenous People includes, Afro-Ecuadorians as part of their work, different ethnic/racial groups. And I'm not sure to what extent that has been carried into legislation or the concept of multiculturalism, nationalism in Ecuador. Might be worth looking at. And I think you have to. I strongly think you have to mention Chinese and Japanese. I mean, I didn't see too many of them in that movie. But I just, since you are doing political science, etc., I think you need to change your format references. Political science and international studies, we usually use the first name of authors, not just the initials. So you might want to just add that. It's also a little better, information. If you have any questions, you can APSR, American Political Science Review, style sheets. So might be adding that. So that's most of what I had to say. Maybe I'll come back later, but
Thank you. So I have to say it was a joy to read your draft, and I found that you mounted a very persuasive case because you were meticulous in the analysis and in presenting the ways in which it's just a fact, right, that while there's a multitude of legislation, that it hasn't really effectuated much political change for the Afro-descendant population and their status, so the mobilization of their status. Some things that I was particularly taken with is that while you don't present the piece as being about comparative law, you do though draw contrast to other Latin American countries, and I think that makes sense. But what you don't do though is make comparisons to the United States. And I'm not saying that that's necessary at all, but here's where I think it might be actually helpful in being even more persuasive with regards to your thesis. It's where you draw the line between the ways in which what the deficiencies, where they're really rooted in, right? Is this focus of law as being just about the individual as an aberrant member of society when that individual discriminates, as opposed to the problem being systemic in the body of structural racism. And so the law is designed to only address an individual, then of course it's going to be deficient at addressing the systemic problems. Here's why I think that inserting even just a little bit about U.S. law is helpful, because often the idea is that structural racism can't be addressed. The idea is that law can't reach us because it's really about the individual and the individual's heart and mind. And how can law address that? And so, as a lawyer in the room, I'm here to say that law does help. It can't do everything, but no tool can. But it is a tool that is helpful. In the United States case, historically, not so much today, but historically has been useful. And so, some very pointed examples would be, I'll go to the weeds of law, sorry for a moment, a case from the 1970s in New York, from the United States, of Griggs versus Howard. This Griggs case is phenomenal about talking about the ways in which law should reach not only the individual, but that law should reach systems. And that law doesn't always have to demand that you have an individual who you show is a bad person, who had bad thoughts, and intentionally went after someone based on their race, but instead, it can, at times can be adequate just to show that there are statistical disparities that can't be explained away. And that in the absence of a justified reason for having all Black people be segregated into the janitorial staff, as opposed to being able to take the test to be able to have a white collar position in a particular workplace, that itself is something that is discrimination. That we don't need to point to a bad guy. And that approach of having what in the US is called disparate impact approaches to ferreting out discrimination had a significant transformative effect on our labor market, right? The workplace, from the 70s to the 80s, right before Reaganomics, we had some serious change happening, right? And it affected people's lives. Do you have a growth of a Black middle class in the United States because of this change, looking at a disparate impact? So even though you, of course, will meet with the critique of, oh, why compare to the United States? Oh, that's an imperialist perspective. I think it's useful to draw the comparison because it shows the utility of what you're saying you want the frame to change to. And then, while I'm at it, as far as thinking about sort of this U.S. lens on things, I understood where you were trying to go with drawing the distinction with this language of the difference between discrimination and racism, sort of individual versus systemic. I just wasn't so convinced that language choice illuminated as much as you wanted it to. And this is why. There's a lot of literature about the difference between prejudice and discrimination, prejudice and racism, that you could draw on, but you're not adequately able to do so, sort of from a critical race theory perspective. The language of racism and discrimination, it just seems a little bit too muddled together. It's harder to disaggregate threads. Whereas if you're talking prejudice, which is about attitudes, which is about individuals, and racism and discrimination together, that gets at the structural and systemic, and the ways in which a law's focus just on prejudice, right? So that you can have Peruvian law that's just about, did you use the N-word in public and in ways that's problematic? We'll go after that bad person who said that thing, as opposed to looking at the ways in which the labor market is completely designed not to allow for any mobility for Afro-descendants. I think that language lets you, changing the language to instead be about prejudice versus discrimination/racism, but it gets better at what you want to eliminate as the problem, and allows you to draw on whole critical race theory literature to show what you find problematic.
I'd just like to pick up on that very quickly, if I might. As you're well aware, law has a very good and you've got a plethora of laws and legal instruments, constitutions in Latin America that compliance is much less than it is in the United States. So I thought your points were very relevant, but I think we have to distinguish them with the Latin American context very closely. And we have to realize that the ability to change attitudes, racism, values, was heavily impacted by legislation very because that may be more difficult to achieve in Latin America and Peru, and that I thought you brought out the extent of the racism of your concept. What was it? Mama Negra, Mama. I mean, it just blows you away. Stereotypical caricatures, etc. So there's an awful lot to do there. Certainly, passing laws, other laws like they did in Brazil would help, but it may not have the same, despite it's the state, it may not have the same effect or as beneficial effect as it has in the United States. It continues to have, yes, legal structures and legal constraints, legal mechanisms to reduce racism.
Well, actually, that brings up an idea that draws on your own professional experience. It seems to me that you could insert even more fully into the thesis. Is that one of the main differences between the U.S. and Latin America and many other regions is that the U.S. has not only had its our legislation was symbolic too. It not only had symbolic legislation, though, it over time had agency application to really make the law relevant and enforceable. Right? So meaning you could have it on the books and it wouldn't mean anything either in the United States, but we have the EEOC getting in there. We have the federal agencies doing contracting work that obligate federal agencies to demand that their independent contractors have diversity within their workforce. So meaning there's a additional layer here that's not just about law, it's also about creating agency and structures. And so your experience in being in such a kind of area, right, could speak to the power that can bring, right? You can see it from the gender angle. Now we needed to sort of put some pedal to the metal with regards to the Afro question.
So, so I guess, you know, we talked about some of this before. I guess you see now what you get for inviting more people to the meeting. You get more comments. I want to remind everybody that this is a master's thesis, not a dissertation. And that our expectations are, of course, very high, which has a lot to do with, you know, with Mariela, because she, I think, has achieved a whole lot when she was here, and I think everybody had very high expectations and has very high expectations for her. So I guess it is reflected in the kind of comments you gave. So you should listen to them carefully and consider them. But again, also remember that this is framework here is a master's thesis. Now, I do think, you know, on, the first comment that Harry made about the subjectivity, I feel partly to be blamed for this one, as well as a question about, you know, the use of Tanya Pashal's framework, because I was the one who strongly suggested using this framework, and she, of course, uses this term subjectivity. So that the usage of subjectivity is not something that Mariela invented, it's something that Tanya Pashal used, and of course Peru was so successful, won all these prizes in the meantime. It was a stellar work and really received a lot of recognition, and it was very prestigious that it came at that moment renewable. And it had offered a framework to really go beyond the initial assessment, which was, how can you explain that this happened in Peru to begin with? My initial take was, well, you need to look at Durban, and because it has triggered so many responses in so many different countries. But then came Partial spoke and said, well, this is actually, there's another story that's more complex than that. And I think very, very happy that this happened at the same time. So this goes back to Tiana's this usage also. I think, you know, this comment about the comparison to the United States, I think it's very interesting, you know, kind of for the sake of saying, well, where do you want this to go, or how would this look like? So I think that makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, I think Harry's comment to say, well, you know, we understand that in the United States, we have, I was not aware of, you know, but there seems to be something in between that actually makes the law stick and actually be enforced. Whereas in Latin America, it always seems like there's the most beautiful law in the world, and the reality is highly disconnected from it. So that might be, for future work, I would say, something to kind of really consider, the lack of enforcement mechanisms, the lack of agencies, the lack of structures that actually link the law to a reality. Also, the lack of lawyers, right? I mean, the idea that here in every corner, it seems like you stumbled across a lawyer. Over there, there is a lack of lawyers, particularly socially engaged lawyers, to kind of enforce reality. So I think all of this is something to consider, and I think integrate to the extent that you mentioned in your thesis. That's what I'm hearing, without necessarily being able to really explore this in this thesis and what that means. That there are maybe no enforcement mechanisms, no agencies. That's something to find, as you're sure. The questions I have, I think there's a few things that I find really interesting, and I think given your own legal expertise, I think you pointed out some very interesting things. On the one side, you made this differentiation between race and ethnicity. And you said, well, this is not grouping because there's a racial approach here, and this grouping better the indigenous folks because they have their ethnic approach here. So then, as we talked about, I said, well, it's interesting to consider the work of Hooker on this. We kind of already launched this debate. So I'm wondering if that's something that I think there's a good conclusion there to expand this some more. And we didn't really talk about it too much right now, but I could explain to you a little bit this difference between the racial approach that this, which is this, so there's different ways, I guess, to slice this. There's individual versus collective rights? Is it racism, discrimination, prejudice? And what she offers there is racism and ethnicity. So I think that these are all different ways of understanding how it is maybe could be better. So I want you to kind of let me talk a little about this. And I find it interesting that you say you call for. Mm-hmm. There might be like a real language or something. I'm wondering who you're calling on. Who's gonna listen? So I guess it's just a curiosity. Do you think that you in your future see this call being heard by anybody, or what do you envision?
Well, we are recording, so there is some stuff that I cannot say, but
hold on a second. Who is recording what?
We're live streaming.
But who's online that you cannot say anything?
I'm still working closely with the Ministry of Culture, which is the one that is in charge of enforcing, and not necessarily of enacting, but of enforcing the acknowledgement of indigenous one of this, and of indigenous people another. And right now we are in the process of not reformulating the laws that we already have, but revising and try to go a step beyond what it is now. The body of regulation law, like to create some steps and better measures.
Maybe there is a segment to talk about the basic issue.
Yes, that's it. So the best way I can explain that the laws of the presentation is actually starting with an approach to indigenous people. So the kind of legislation that protects the rights of indigenous people are, for instance, legislation that protects and preserve their language. And then legislation that protects the lands, the specific land conservation, how people that is outside of the government should approach or not people that is in initial contact with them. And so this is the kind of legislation that protects the elements that make indigenous people. In the case, and from then on, we can discern that this is an ethnic group. We are protecting the ethnicity of. In contrast, when you go and review the legislation that protects the rights of the descendants, are pretty much a heightened level of protection over the same protections that regular people like you and I. So, because they are not protecting necessarily Afroperuvian culture or all the elements that make Afroperuvians Afroperuvians, then we hope that they are treated like a racial group. The level of protection is different. So from there is that I make the distinction between ethnic group and racial group, and also how they are protected. So the fact that the indigenous peoples are protected in a way where their specificity is protected, whereas in the case of Afro-Descendants, they are protected from their just with the same rights that everybody else has, is that also draws the distinction that these people are protected from their rights to difference, whereas Black people is protected from the right to equality, to population. And these are collective rights that can be enacted on the grounds of the treaty as a group, whereas the rights of Afro-Descendants.
I think there's something there. So I think that's interesting. So the only question or a comment I have to this, or is there any, maybe one of the differences, is there any sort of positive promotion that you see in the indigenous legislation that is absent? So is the legislation with reflects just kind of negative rights, protected rights, whereas indigenous you see also some promotion, some positive push towards. Think about affirmative action or any of these things. Is that also a difference there?
In the case of Peru, there is not. We don't have necessarily affirmative action like in the case of Brazil, the society, because they are not protected as a specific group that is different from the society at large. So we don't necessarily have measures that are giving them, let's say, a leg up. For indigenous peoples, we do. In case of scholarships, in the case of international universities.
Well, kind of building on that, one of the questions that I had that we didn't really talk about, given the level of engagement between indigenous activism and Afro-Peruvian activism, to what extent are they in conversation, or do they see their interests competing? What is that relationship?
In an ideal world, and to be completely honest, this is something that I would like to push more forward, although for this in particular, I don't really have much power on it. I think that different social groups should be able to create alliances, if not articulate for the sake of their own claims, just create alliances in the topics that they can potentiate if they work together. So in my mind, it actually makes sense for the and the Black people and the Afroperuvians to create some alliances in some specific things. For example, the eradication of stereotypes is something that we benefit not only society at large, very particularly. Now, if, what I found in the literature, even highlighted in the literature, is that the process in which or how Black people came to the Americas, Black people are so rigid, have created this resentment or disconnect between the activism and that. So first of all, we have this Afroperuvian thinker, Pepe. What he says is, well, because the first Black people came in the same boats, they were by the indigenous people as well. So that tense relation, that tense relation comes from a society. So now there is not necessarily a relation.
Even not just this conference, but part of the Columbia. Even I think you say so much better than it's understandable because he's been sort of supporting.
Let's open it up to the audience and see if there's comments, questions. This side.
I looked around, no one else. I thought it was an excellent presentation and it's a great topic. I have a question about origins too. I'm picking up on some of my things that my colleagues were asking. So what do you, in terms of causation, what do you attribute this change going from discourses and policies of mestizaje and multiculturalism and racial democracy in Brazil and so on to changes that result in changes in legislation? Thinking of Colombia 1991 Constitution and other things that established indigenous lands, indigenous rights as rights in and for particular peoples, native peoples, and ethnicized, racialized, whatever, as part of that process. That's historically that's not been the case, given sort of the politics. What is that? What do you attribute that? And this is obviously, but it was part of that process.
So what the literature identifies as pretty much the trend that started the whole thing was this notion of multicultural constitutional.
Right.
That is around the 70s when these countries start to leave the dictatorial, the leaders of the start to transition into democracy. Now we come to a broader sense of citizenship where different groups are starting to be recognized. But at the same time, we have, of course, the inheritance of the first and the second world conference spaces that is also saying, hey, by the way, racism is something that has to be addressed in different countries because this notion of development and the numbers are not necessarily moving at a steady pace because they're not doing important sections. Right? So this is something that actually is going to affect at a national level and the international level different elements move towards the affirmation of citizenship of different groups, but also that is promoted by at the UN level, at the international level.
Having no more fundamental causes like economic causes, in terms of globalization, the condition of modernity, post-1973.
All those elements are contributing. Well, what I'm trying to say is, I don't think that there is just one thing that is going to shift the racial politics in every country in Latin America, because one, it happened at different times, and also it starts to respond to different things.
Well, what do the elites have to gain by this new dispensation? In other words, they're not doing it out of the kindness of their heart or because they all of a sudden they're woke or something like that, right? So what does this do that allows people to proclaim Afroperuvian identity but yet remain in the same?
I can tell you my own personal interpretation about Peru specifically. I was not necessarily popular, but here it is. So,
wait, we're streaming.
I know. I know, but I'm moderating myself. So, so by the year 2000, we're leaving a government, the government of Afroperuvians, that is known famously for their high number of human rights violations. So that's one thing. On the other side, we have it continues with the Afro-Sustainable population in Peru. This, yes, movement that is not necessarily the strongest, but it has a history of being very pacifist. It has a history of not creating a lot of problems for the government. So recognizing the rights of Afro-descendants at that time was a big win for the government because it was also following international law at a very low cost.
I want to add something. I got you, I see you, but just I want to launch something here, almost like a hypothesis, and I'm looking for people who want to do this work because I know there's several people in the room who are thinking about writing pieces. Because I do think this is a very interesting phenomenon, and I do think it is connected to issue of law not sticking or not being enforced. Because I do think that we had, and I think Tanya showed this very well, several United Nations, several declarations that provide opportunities for these countries, like Peru, to look good internationally. And at the same time, enacting law which kind of they move would not have any real consequences. So, given the history of laws, so I think that's a theme you spoke about this, and hopefully that you also. So I think that's really something worth exploring because I agree with Harry that there is kind of a need to bring this analysis that we have in the US about the force of the law in changing society, bring this contextualized in Latin America. But Harry was.
Yeah, Mariela, I really am provoked by your work. But essentially, I'm looking at this title and I am really thinking about the way that ideologies of global imperialist representations of white supremacy work from this angle of from blacks to Afro-Peruvians, as if that wording blacks, as if that's, I'm not quite sure how you would want to represent that, because the movement, it almost seems like a movement from to, as if blacks, I'm not even quite sure, is that representational of African descendancy? What is that, blacks?
I have to think about this.
I have to think about that. But if I were to replace the word blacks with Negros, would that make sense? I mean, I feel like I need to step by your office and help. But I don't.
Yeah, but because I'm really, and I don't want to drive this, but we have to be careful about using ideology that promotes the concept that coming from being black, moving to something Afro-Peruvian is like better. And so that black, you understand that? So that ideology, because it seems almost like a paradox, because in the second part of your title, this idea of black political subjectivity, it seems to give priority to the presence and the importance of African descendancy. But that's not exactly what's coming across, because that black in global representation of white supremacy is negative. So I just would really want you to consider what you mean in terminology in terms of black in relationship to white supremacy globally. And then the second thing is the representation of gender politics within the context of African descendantry. To think about what, and I know you said women and within this Afro-Peruvian context, but what I think would be interesting is to at least talk about the ways that even within the context there of this subjectivity possibility, what are the gender politics going on within the Afro-Peruvian community? Because this, and class, you've already pointed it out. We're talking about lower class black folks, right? Okay, but what are the gender politics? And then sexuality. So I know that this is your thesis, but I think these are issues from an intersectional standpoint that really need to be addressed.
May I make a friendly amendment to Gary's suggestions? It's just what because I was very taken with the comment about from black to Afro-Peruvian, but one amendment I thought that maybe you let me know when you think this response would be to change the title from black invisibility to Afro-Peruvian citizenship. Right? So that's it about blackness being problematic. That's about the invisibility of blackness, right? And then Afro-Peruvian citizenship being truly a part of the polity. Friendly amendment.